11:14 on a Tuesday night in October, and Gerald Pruitt stood on the porch of 417 Birch Hollow Road with his coat buttoned to the throat, telling Mara Doyle she had until midnight. He said it the way a man reads a grocery list. No heat in it. He held his phone loose in one hand, screen already lit, the sheriff's non-emergency number sitting there ready to go the second the clock ran out. Behind him the porch light swung a little in the wind and threw his shadow long across the boxes stacked in the hallway, the lamp with no shade, the mismatched kitchen chairs Mara hadn't gotten around to selling. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end. Something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to... I've been more than patient, Gerald said. 2 months, Mara. I've got a buyer waiting and a mortgage that doesn't care about your circumstances. I have the first month, she said. I have it right now. Tonight, if you'll just give me until Friday for the rest. Friday isn't the deal anymore. He looked past her into the house, at 9-year-old Eli sitting cross-legged on the stairs with his backpack already on, his ears red from trying not to cry in front of a stranger. He's got school in the morning, Gerald. Where exactly do you want us to go at midnight on a Tuesday? That's not something I can solve for you. He said it without meeting her eyes, studying the porch boards instead, and for one brief second, Mara thought she saw something crack in him, some flicker of a man who did not enjoy being the person standing on this particular porch, saying these particular words. It closed over again almost as fast as it opened. Midnight, he said, and went down the steps to his truck, and didn't look back. Mara shut the door because there was nothing else to do with her hands. She stood in the front hall of a house that wasn't hers, that had never really felt like it belonged to anyone since the day the Pruitt family stopped living in it themselves, and she made herself breathe until the sound coming out of her throat stopped resembling a sob and started resembling something she could work with. "Mum?" Eli's voice, small, from the stairs. "Are we really leaving tonight?" "We're going to figure it out," she said. Which wasn't a lie exactly. It was just a sentence built entirely out of hope, said in a voice she'd practiced enough over the last 11 months that it almost always came out steady. Eli came down off the stairs and pressed himself against her side without a word, and Mara stood there in the hallway with one arm around her son and the other hand still on the doorknob, looking at the boxes they hadn't finished packing and the clock on the microwave glowing through the kitchen doorway, and made herself start moving before the fear had a chance to catch up with her feet. She had 46 minutes and a house full of a life that wouldn't fit into the back of a 19-year-old Corolla with a check engine light that had been on since spring. It hadn't always felt this precarious. 18 months earlier, Mara Doyle had walked through the front door of 417 Birch Hollow Road with a real estate flyer folded in her back pocket and Eli's small fingers wrapped around hers, and the house had felt like the first lucky thing to happen to her in a year. Built in 1911 by a family whose name nobody in town remembered anymore, it had a wraparound porch with 2 rotted boards near the steps, a kitchen with a window over the sink that looked out on an old plum tree still bearing fruit, some years despite decades of neglect, and a deep, cold cellar that smelled permanently of damp stone no matter the season, and one section of foundation wall, off toward the back, that was poured concrete instead of the fieldstone used everywhere else, a detail the real estate listing had never mentioned, and that Mara had chalked up, when she noticed it at all, to some long-ago repair job done by a previous owner with more money than matching materials. It was too big for the 2 of them, and too old for anybody's real budget. Plaster cracked in a lightning bolt shape above the front windows. Every closet held a faint ghost of cedar and dust. But the rent was low, because nobody else wanted a house that needed this much work, and Gerald Pruitt, who owned it along with 4 other rentals scattered around Colworth, hadn't seemed to care who moved in as long as the check cleared on the first. She had taken it because of that window over the sink, and because for one whole afternoon, standing in the empty front room, with dust turning gold in the slanted light, she had let herself believe that she and Eli were about to start over somewhere good. She had learned things about herself in the 11 months since Danny died that she had never particularly wanted to know, that she could function on 4 hours of sleep for weeks at a stretch if she had to, that she could sit across from a child at breakfast and answer his questions about heaven with a steadiness she did not remotely feel, because he needed the steadiness more than he needed her honesty about how uncertain she actually was. That grief, it turned out, didn't announce itself the way the books said it would. It mostly just sat underneath everything else, a low hum she'd gotten so used to that she sometimes went whole days forgetting it was there, until something small snagged on it, a song on the radio, the smell of sawdust, and it came roaring back up to the surface like it had never left at all. Colworth had been shedding people steadily for a decade by then, ever since the Redfern furniture plant on the east side of town closed and took 1,100 jobs with it, and the empty storefronts along Main Street had a way of making the whole place feel like it was holding its breath, waiting to find out whether it was a town that was dying slowly or one that had simply not finished figuring out what it was going to become instead. Rent was cheap because there wasn't much competition for it. Wages were low for the same reason. Mara had grown up 40 minutes north in a town not so different from this one, and she'd told herself, moving in, that at least here she knew the rules of the game, even if she didn't much care for how it was played. Her husband Danny had been dead 11 months by then. A wreck on Route 9, black ice, a curve he'd driven 1,000 times, coming home late from a framing job 2 towns over. Mara got the call at 10 past midnight, and she remembered every detail of it, with a clarity she wished she didn't have. The dispatcher's careful, over-rehearsed voice, the sound of her own bare feet on the kitchen floor, Eli asleep upstairs, not yet knowing that the whole shape of his life had already changed while he slept through it. She still remembered standing at the front of a half-full funeral home on a Wednesday in November, wearing a black dress borrowed from Deb because she owned nothing appropriate and hadn't had it in her to shop for something new, watching Eli in his one good shirt shake hands with people 3 times his age, like he was the one who was supposed to be comforting them instead of the other way around. Danny's foreman from the framing crew had stood up and talked about a man who never let a new hire eat lunch alone on his first day. Mara had not been able to get up and say anything at all. She had sat in the front row with Eli's hand in hers and Renata's arm around her shoulders and simply endured it, the way she had learned, over the following 11 months, that most of grief actually was. Not a single dramatic collapse, just a long, ordinary enduring, one Tuesday at a time. She still thought about the Saturday morning 6 weeks before the accident, when Danny had spent 4 hours in the driveway of their old apartment complex, teaching Eli to ride his bike without training wheels, running alongside him with one hand hovering an inch off the seat, not touching, promising he wasn't touching even when he was. Eli had gone down twice and scraped both knees and cried, and Danny had knelt in the gravel next to him and told him that falling down was just part of the deal, that nobody who ever learned to ride a bike had skipped that part, and by the 4th try, Eli had wobbled the whole length of the parking lot on his own, with Danny sprinting behind him, laughing, shouting that he was flying. Mara had watched from the kitchen window with a dish towel still in her hands. She had not known, standing there, that she was watching one of the last dozen ordinary afternoons she would ever get with him. Nobody ever knows that in the moment. That was the part that still caught her sometimes, at strange hours, worse than the grief itself. She had met him at 19, at a job she'd hated, stocking shelves at a hardware store 2 towns over from where she'd grown up, and he'd come in every Saturday for 6 weeks buying odd single items, a box of nails one week, a paint roller the next, before he finally admitted he didn't need any of it. He just wanted an excuse to talk to the girl working the register. They'd married 3 years later in his cousin's backyard because it was the cheapest venue anybody in the family could offer them, and Mara still had the paper cutout bells they'd strung along the fence line in a shoebox somewhere in the boxes now stacked in the front hall. Danny had been the one who was good with money. He kept a coffee can of 20s in the hall closet for emergencies, and a spreadsheet on an old laptop that Mara still couldn't make herself open. 11 months later, the password still taped inside the cover in his own handwriting. Without him, the math of their life stopped working almost immediately. There was a life insurance policy that turned out to be smaller than either of them had ever quite gotten around to discussing, and it disappeared within 4 months, swallowed by the funeral costs and the last 2 payments on his truck, and the ambulance ride he never woke up for. There was Mara's job at the Ferncrest Diner on Main Street, which had been fine, had even been good, back when Sal owned the place and knew every regular's order before they sat down and let his servers keep every dollar of their own tips. Then Sal retired to Florida in the spring and sold the diner to a man named Frank Mercer, who showed up his first week with a laminated binder full of labor cost targets and a habit of standing in the kitchen doorway with a clipboard while the servers worked the floor. He cut the morning shift from 5 people to 3 inside his first month. Mara went in on a Wednesday expecting her usual 6 a.m. to 2 and found her name gone from the schedule board except for 2 shifts a week. "It's not personal," Frank told her, not looking up from the clipboard, when she found him in the kitchen doorway with a coffee pot still in her hand. "Numbers are numbers. Deb's got seniority, and the Hendricks girl works for less because she's still living with her folks, you understand. I have a kid, Frank. Everybody's got something, Mara." He finally looked up then, and there was something almost like sympathy in it, which somehow made the whole exchange worse rather than better. "I'll call you if a shift opens." Deb Ruiz, who had worked the counter beside Mara for 6 years, found her crying in the walk-in cooler 20 minutes later and didn't say anything comforting, because there wasn't anything comforting to say. She just handed Mara a rag so she'd have something to do with her hands, and the two of them restocked milk crates together in silence until Mara could breathe right again. The Monday before the eviction, Mara had worked one of her 2 remaining shifts, 6 to 2, and a man in a hunting jacket at table 9 had sent his eggs back twice. The second time loud enough that the whole counter turned to look, and told her on his way out that she'd have made a decent living 40 years ago before everybody got so soft. She had smiled and thanked him for coming in, because that was the job, and carried his plate back to the kitchen and scraped it into the trash with her hands shaking just slightly. Not from anger exactly, more from the sheer effort of holding herself together in front of an audience for 8 hours at a stretch. Deb had caught her eye across the pass-through window and rolled her own, and that small, wordless solidarity had carried Mara through the rest of the shift better than anything else could have. Not every table was like the man in the hunting jacket. There was a retired schoolteacher named Mr. Abernathy, who came in most Fridays and always left a $10 tip on a $7 breakfast, and who had taken to asking after Eli by name, remembering some small detail Mara had mentioned weeks before, whether he'd started Little League yet, or how the science fair project had turned out. It wasn't much, it wasn't rent money, but there were mornings when a stranger remembering her son's name was the only soft thing that happened to Mara before noon, and she had learned not to take that kind of small mercy for granted. Not anymore. 26 hours a week wasn't enough. Not with the propane bill climbing as the weather turned and Eli's shoes wearing through at the toe again, and the $12 a month it cost to keep his inhaler filled at the pharmacy on 3rd. Mara picked up a cleaning route for 2 dentist offices downtown, 3 nights a week after her diner shift, scrubbing waiting room carpets and break room microwaves, with Eli doing his homework in an empty exam chair because there was nowhere else for him to be at 9 o'clock on a school night. For a while, that patchwork had held. It wasn't good, but it held. She remembered one night in August, close to 11, mopping the same stretch of tile floor in the Cedar Street waiting room for the 3rd time, because she couldn't get a coffee stain out from under the fish tank stand, and looking up to find Eli asleep sideways across 2 of the vinyl chairs with his shoes still on, a math worksheet half finished on his lap, and thinking that this, exactly this, was not the life she had promised him the day they moved into that house with the plum tree in the yard. She had finished the floor anyway. There hadn't been another option available to her at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night that wasn't this one. She went to the Colworth Community Bank on a Thursday afternoon in September, with her hair pulled back and a folder of pay stubs organized by month, and sat across a laminate desk from a loan officer named Patrice, who had kind eyes and a framed photo of 2 golden retrievers angled toward the visitor's chair, like it was meant to make the whole room feel less like a place where people got told no. "I just need something to bridge me," Mara said. "Even $1,000. I can show you I'll pay it back. I've never missed a payment on anything in my life until this year." Patrice went through the folder carefully, page by page, and Mara watched her face for as long as she could stand to, before she had to look down at her own hands instead. The trouble isn't your character, Ms. Doyle. It's the debt-to-income ratio, and it's the fact that nothing here is what the bank calls stable, month to month. I wish I had better news for you. If your hours at the diner go back up, or if you can show 3 consecutive months of steady income, I'd be glad to look at this again. What about a cosigner? That could help, if you have someone with strong credit willing to take that on. Patrice said it kindly, but Mara was already running through the short list of people in her life who might qualify, and coming up with nobody who both had the credit and would say yes without a lecture attached to it. Renata and Craig owned their home outright and still lived like every dollar was borrowed against tomorrow. Her own parents were gone, her mother 8 years now, her father longer than that. There wasn't a cosigner. There had never really been a version of this conversation where there was going to be one. I don't have 3 months, Mara said, and Patrice had nothing to say back to that, because there wasn't anything to say. Mara sat in her car in the bank parking lot afterward and cried until her chest hurt, and then she wiped her face with the sleeve of her jacket and drove to the elementary school to pick up Eli, because the job now, the only job that actually mattered, was making sure none of this showed on her face by the time he climbed into the passenger seat. By the numbers, which she ran in her head at least once a day whether she wanted to or not, she owed Gerald Pruitt $1,100 for September, and another $1,100 for October, $2,200 total, plus the $75 late fee he'd added on to each month per the lease she'd signed, without reading closely enough 18 months ago. $23.50, she had $412 in her checking account, and a car worth maybe $800 if she was being generous about the check engine light, and there was no version of the arithmetic, run any way she tried to run it, that closed the gap before the end of October. The dentist office on Cedar Street let her cleaning contract go at the end of September, folded into a bulk deal with a commercial cleaning company that could service all 3 of their locations for less than Mara charged for one alone. She missed the September rent entirely, not $1 of it. Gerald Pruitt came by on the 2nd Saturday of October, and Mara would remember, for a long time afterward, how ordinary it had felt, right up until it wasn't. He'd knocked, and she'd let him in because it was raining, and he'd stood in her front hall in a windbreaker, with water beaded on the shoulders, turning his cap over in his hands, in a way that almost looked like discomfort. "I'm not trying to be a hard case here, Mara," he said. "I've got a mortgage on this place, same as everybody else. I've got expenses of my own you don't know a thing about." "I know I owe you," she said. "I'm not arguing that. I'm asking for time. I gave you time in June. I gave you time in August." He looked around the front hall, at the crayon drawings taped to the stair rail, at the child-sized rain boots lined up by the door, and something in his face went flatter, more settled, the look of a man closing a door on a version of the conversation he might once have preferred to have. "I need this place empty by the end of the month. I've got interest payments, Mara. I've got people counting on me too. Is there anything I could do? Extra chores? Upkeep on the place? I could paint the porch? Fix the railing on the back steps? Anything." "It's not about the house needing work, Mara." For a second his voice had almost gentled, and Mara had let herself hope, foolishly, that the conversation might bend somewhere softer. Then his jaw set again. "This isn't personal. I need it empty. That's the whole of it." "Nothing's personal to you people, is it?" she'd said, more tired than angry, and immediately wished she hadn't, because his face had closed the rest of the way at that, whatever narrow window had been open a second before shutting for good. "I'll be back on the 31st, he'd said, and let himself out into the rain without another word. He left an actual notice on the door 2 days later, folded into thirds and taped where anyone walking a dog past the house could read it, and Mara tore it down before Eli got home from school and stood in the kitchen with it crumpled in her fist for a long time before she could make herself throw it away. She hadn't understood, not fully, until Deb told her 2 days ago in the diner kitchen, quiet, over a rack of ketchup bottles she was refilling for the dinner rush. Deb's cousin cut hair 2 chairs down from where Gerald Pruitt's wife got her roots done, and the story that had travelled down that particular chain was that Gerald had a buyer lined up. A developer named Dale Emmerich who wanted 3 lots along Birch Hollow Road, including the Pruitt house, to put up a row of new townhomes, and that Emmerich's offer had a financing window attached to it, closing at the end of October. "He's not chasing your back rent, honey," Deb said, capping a ketchup bottle with more force than it needed. "He's chasing an empty house he can hand over with a bow on it before the end of the month. You could pay him every dime tomorrow, and I don't believe it would change a single thing." There was more to it than that, if the rumour mill was to be trusted, and in a town the size of Colworth it usually was. Eventually, even when nobody could point to exactly where a story had started, Gerald had refinanced 2 of his rental properties 4 years back to bankroll a car wash venture out on the highway that had folded within 18 months, and word was he'd been treading water on the interest ever since, robbing one mortgage to feed another the way a man might shuffle unpaid credit cards. The sale to Emmerich wasn't extra money for Gerald Pruitt. It was the difference, according to Deb's cousin's version of events anyway, between keeping the rest of what he owned and losing all of it at once. It also wasn't the first time this year Gerald had pushed a tenant out of one of his properties, Deb added, almost as an afterthought, wiping down the prep counter while she said it. The Kowalski family had left the little rental over on Persimmon Street back in the spring, not 2 years into their lease, and nobody had ever gotten a straight answer as to why Gerald had suddenly wanted that house empty either. Mara hadn't told Eli any of that. She'd told him they were between houses for a little while, an adventure, the kind of thing that happens sometimes and isn't anybody's fault, and he had looked at her with the particular flat patience of a 9-year-old who had already learned, from one phone call at 10 past midnight 11 months before, that adults don't always tell you the truth to protect you. Sometimes they tell it to you late, after it's already happened to you anyway. 2 nights before, once Eli was asleep, Mara had finally made herself call her sister Renata in Danville, 2 hours south, and ask if she and Eli could stay a while. Renata had said yes before Mara even finished the question, the way she always did, but Mara had heard her husband Craig somewhere behind her in the kitchen asking how long a while meant, and Renata's voice going muffled and firm as she covered the phone to answer him. Craig had never once been cruel to Mara's face. He had a way, instead, of asking careful, reasonable-sounding questions about her plans and her budget and her job search that always left her feeling smaller by the end of the conversation than she had at the start of it, and the thought of 2 weeks or 2 months on their fold-out couch, of Eli tiptoeing around a man who tallied grocery receipts out loud, sat in Mara's stomach like a stone she couldn't put down. "You come whenever you need to," Renata had told her, and meant it. "Don't you dare feel bad about it." "I won't," Mara had said, and had felt bad about it anyway, the whole rest of that night and every night since. Now it was 11:16, and she had 44 minutes, and a house that still smelled faintly of the pot roast she'd made 3 nights ago because she hadn't been able to bring herself to waste the ingredients, even with everything else falling apart around her, one bill at a time. A car had slowed on the street outside twice already while she worked, headlights sweeping across the front curtains before moving on, and both times Mara had caught herself freezing mid-motion, waiting to see if it would stop, before she made herself keep going. Birch Hollow Road wasn't a busy street. People noticed a truck idling in a driveway past 10 at night. By tomorrow morning, there would be a version of this story circulating through Colworth that had nothing to do with what had actually happened, and everything to do with what people already believed about a woman raising a boy alone on a diner paycheck. And there wasn't a single thing Mara could do about that, except keep her chin up and her boxes stacked straight, so that whoever slowed down to look would at least see someone leaving with dignity, instead of falling apart on the lawn. She worked fast after that, dishes wrapped in dish towels because she'd run out of newspaper. The photo albums, the one thing she would have run back into a burning building for, stacked in a laundry basket with a towel folded over the top like a blanket. Danny's flannel jacket, which had hung on the hook by the back door for 11 months because she had never once managed to move it, taken down now and pressed once against her face before she folded it into the basket on top of the photo albums, where she could find it fast. The living room went into 3 boxes and a garbage bag, the couch left behind because there was no way it was fitting in the Corolla and nowhere yet to put it if it did. She wrapped the one framed photograph that sat on the mantel, Danny holding Eli as a newborn, in a bath towel and set it upright between two boxes where it couldn't fall. She left the curtains. She left the rug, an ugly green thing that had come with the house and that she had never once liked but would apparently still miss, standing there in the doorway for one strange, unguarded second before she made herself keep moving. Eli's room took longer than it should have, because everything in it seemed to want to be carried out one piece at a time instead of boxed. The drawings taped above his bed, dinosaurs mostly, one lopsided portrait of the three of them, that still included Danny even though he'd drawn it only 4 months ago. A stuffed rabbit, missing one eye, that he still slept with, and would have died before admitting to a single friend at school. That morning, at pickup, he had asked her in the car, without any warm-up at all, whether he'd still get to go to Colworth Elementary if they moved to Aunt Renata's, and Mara had told him she didn't know yet, and watched in the rearview mirror as he turned to look out his window instead of at her, the particular stillness he got when he was trying hard not to make a bad day worse by making a fuss about it. She had wanted, in that moment, to pull the car over and hold him until the wanting to cry passed for both of them. She hadn't. There hadn't been time then either. The doorbell rang while she was wrapping the last of the good dishes, and for one lurching second she thought Gerald had come back already, that the 44 minutes had somehow already run out. But it was Pearl Okafor from next door, 71 years old, and wrapped in a cardigan the colour of oatmeal, holding a foil-covered casserole dish in both hands like an offering. "I saw the truck," Pearl said, stepping inside without being asked, the way she'd done 100 times over the last year and a half, ever since the week Mara moved in and Pearl had shown up with a bag of tomatoes from her garden and stayed 2 hours talking about nothing in particular. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't. Where's that boy of yours?" "Packing his shoes." Mara's voice cracked on the second word, and she hated it. "Pearl, I don't have time. I've got 40-some minutes. I know. I can read a clock same as you." Pearl set the casserole dish down on the one clear corner of the kitchen counter and put both hands on Mara's shoulders, firm, the way she might have steadied a ladder somebody else was climbing. "You listen to me. You are not the first person that man has done this to, and I don't expect you'll be the last, and none of it is a reflection on you. You hear me? It doesn't feel that way. Grief never does." Pearl's eyes went somewhere else for a second, further back than the last hour. "I've lived next to this house, going on 43 years. Watched 3 different families come and go out of it, before you ever showed up with that flyer in your pocket. This was Pruitt land clean back before I was your age. Old Augusta ran a jewelry shop down on Main, before your time, before mine too, near enough, but my mother remembered her well. Strange woman by all accounts. Kept to herself something fierce. Wouldn't trust her own son with so much as the key to the shop register, and everybody in town knew why, though nobody ever said it out loud where a Pruitt might overhear it. "Why?" Mara asked, only half listening, folding a dish towel around a stack of plates. "Because Walter Pruitt would have gambled the shirt off a dead man's back, that's why. Broke his mother's heart a dozen different ways before she went. There were people around here who used to say Augusta never sold half of what folks brought her to repair, that she kept building some kind of hoard back in that shop of hers, rather than let it pass through Walter's hands. Probably nothing but old talk. Small towns love a story better than they love the truth of a thing." Pearl shrugged. "A small, private motion. She died right here in this house, you know, 1971. I was a young woman myself then, just married, living 2 doors down before we bought the place I'm in now. Funny old house, always was. Never could get warm in the back rooms, no matter what anybody did to the furnace. I used to wonder about that." Pearl seemed to catch herself then, and softened her voice back toward the reason she'd actually come over. "Listen, you don't have to make that drive to your sister's tonight if you don't want to. You and that boy can sleep on my sofa bed and figure the rest out in the daylight, when your head isn't spinning." "I can't ask you to do that, Pearl. You didn't ask. I offered." Pearl folded her arms, and for a second the softness in her face hardened into something closer to the look she probably used to shut down foolishness in a classroom, decades back, before she retired from teaching 3rd grade at the very same elementary school Eli attended now. There's no prize for suffering alone that I ever heard of, Mara Doyle. Mara had shaken her head anyway, because Danville felt in some stubborn corner of her chest like the only decision she'd actually managed to make about any of this on her own, and giving it up for a sofa bed 40 feet from the house she was about to lose felt like something she wasn't ready to do yet. I appreciate it. I mean that, but we should get on the road once we're packed. Eli's got school in the morning regardless of where he sleeps tonight. The offer doesn't expire, Pearl had said, and let it go, because she was the kind of woman who knew the difference between pushing and simply making sure a door stayed open. Somewhere upstairs, Eli called down that he'd found all his shoes except one, and Pearl squeezed Mara's arm and said she'd go help him look, and climbed the stairs calling his name in the bright, unbothered voice of someone who had decided, 71 years into her life, that there was no situation so bad it couldn't be met with a little bit of steadiness borrowed and lent back out. Mara stood alone in the kitchen for a moment, with Pearl's words settling over her like the dust that never quite left this house, no matter how many times she swept. Old Augusta wouldn't trust her own son with the key.
Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story.
Kept building some kind of hoard. She didn't know why the words snagged on something in her chest, only that they did, briefly, before the clock on the stove pulled her attention back, and she went to finish clearing out the pantry. The pantry was the coldest room in the house, colder even than the cellar most nights. A fact Mara had chalked up 18 months ago to a bad seal somewhere around the old exterior wall, and never thought about again until Pearl's voice came back to her now, unbidden. Never could get warm in the back rooms no matter what anybody did to the furnace. That was where Eli found her a few minutes later, kneeling on the floor with a box of cereal in her hands, and where he got down beside her without being asked and reached his own arm into the narrow gap behind the bottom shelf, chasing after the little green matchbox car that had slipped out of his jacket pocket while he was pulling boxes down. "My car went under there," he said. "I can feel the edge of it, but I can't reach it. There's a hole back there." "There's not a hole back there, baby. That's just the wall." "There's a hole," he insisted, pulling his arm back out, dust on his sleeve to the elbow, and looked up at her with an expression she recognized instantly, the same stubborn set to his jaw that Danny used to get right before he turned out to be right about something. "Feel it yourself." She almost didn't. She had 38 minutes left and a truck's worth of belongings still scattered through 4 rooms, and every practical instinct told her to pull the shelf away from the wall, fish out the toy car, and keep moving. But something in the way Eli said it, hole, not gap, not crack, made her kneel down beside him on the cold floor and reach her own arm into the space behind the bottom shelf. Her fingers found the wall first, cool plaster, and then, lower and further back than she expected, nothing. Air. A gap wide enough to fit her whole hand through, and beyond it, when she pressed her fingertips forward, a surface that wasn't plaster at all. Wood, old wood, with a seam running through it that her fingers kept catching on, a seam too straight and too deliberate to be a crack in anything. "Huh," she said, and sat back on her heels. She grabbed the flashlight app on her phone and got down flatter, cheek nearly against the cold floorboards, and angled the light into the gap behind the shelf. What came back at her wasn't the raw brick or packed dirt she'd expected from an old foundation wall. It was a panel, a section of dark wood paneling, waist-high, tucked into a recess behind the pantry shelving, where nobody would ever think to look, unless a 9-year-old's toy car happened to roll exactly the right way, into exactly the right crack, on exactly the wrong night. "What is it?" Eli asked, pressed against her shoulder, trying to see past her arm. "I don't know yet." She sat up and looked at the pantry with new eyes. The shelving unit was built in, bolted along one side to a support post, but the whole unit was shallower than it had any right to be, she realized now, shallower by at least 1.5 feet compared to the depth of the wall around it. She had lived in this house for 18 months and cooked 1,000 meals out of that pantry, and never once noticed that the room was smaller on the inside than the house was on the outside. Upstairs, she heard Pearl's voice calling that she'd found the missing shoe under the radiator, and further off, faint but unmistakable through the front windows, the low growl of an engine somewhere out on Birch Hollow Road, slowing maybe, or maybe just passing through toward some other house on some other errand. Mara didn't stop to find out which. 31 minutes, and it might already be him. She should have let it go right there. She told herself that even as her hands were already working the edge of the bottom shelf loose from its bracket, prying at it with the flathead screwdriver she'd grabbed from the kitchen junk drawer without quite deciding to. The bracket screamed against old, dried-out wood, and the shelf came free all at once, dumping the last half box of cereal across the floor in a clatter that made Eli jump backward. Behind it, in the beam of her phone light, was the panel, whole and unbroken, a rectangle of dark wood, maybe 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, set into what should have been solid plaster wall. Someone a long time ago had built a false wall inside a kitchen pantry, deep enough and careful enough that it had survived undiscovered through however many decades of tenants had lived in this house and cooked out of this kitchen and never known a thing was hidden 6 inches from where they kept their cereal. There was a seam around all 4 edges of the panel. Near the bottom right corner, worn nearly smooth by time but still legible if she tilted the light just right, 2 letters had been carved into the wood, deep enough that whoever cut them had meant for them to last. A.P. Augusta Pruitt, Mum. Eli's voice had dropped to a whisper, the way kids' voices do when they sense something has shifted from ordinary into something else, something with weight to it. "Is that a door?" Mara ran her fingers along the seam. It gave, very slightly, at the top, a give that plaster and drywall never had, the particular flecks of old wood built to move even after decades of not moving. Her heart had started doing something complicated in her chest, some tangled combination of the fear that had been sitting there all night and something else now, something that felt dangerously close to hope, except she had learned over the last 11 months not to trust that feeling, because hope had a way of costing her more than it ever gave back. "I think it might be," she said. 26 minutes. She thought about the growl of Gerald's truck outside, about the sheriff's non-emergency line lit up and ready on his phone screen, about Pearl's story of a woman who wouldn't trust her own son, about a whole life currently packed into cardboard boxes in her front hall, waiting to be loaded into a car that might not survive the drive to her sister's. She thought about walking away from this, letting the shelf fall back into place, finishing the packing, being gone by midnight like a woman with nothing left to lose, because that was, as far as she could tell right now, kneeling in a ransacked pantry with dust on her hands, exactly what she was. But there was another version of tonight she hadn't let herself think about yet, one where she'd spent 11 months doing everything asked of her, every extra shift, every sold-off tool, every careful lie to a 9-year-old about how fine everything was going to be, and it still hadn't been enough to keep a roof that wasn't even particularly good over her son's head. Some stubborn, tired part of her wanted, just once, to find out what was on the other side of a door before someone else decided the answer for her. Somewhere behind her, faintly, she heard Pearl's footsteps on the stairs, and Eli's missing shoe finally located, the ordinary sounds of a night that was still, for another few seconds, only as strange as an eviction, and nothing stranger than that. She could call out right now. She could tell Pearl to take Eli into the front room, tell her own hands to stop, put the shelf back, Meet Gerald Pruitt on the porch with nothing more complicated in her face than the exhaustion he already expected to find there. It would have been the easier version of the next hour, by almost any measure. She didn't call out. She got the screwdriver into the seam at the top of the panel and pushed. The wood groaned, a low, dry sound like something exhaling after holding its breath for a very long time, and the panel gave a half-inch, then an inch, swinging inward on a hinge so old it had rusted nearly solid. Cold air came through the gap, air that smelled like nothing Mara had ever encountered before in her life. Mineral and still and impossibly old. The smell of a room that had not been opened to the rest of the world in longer than she had been alive. She got her fingers into the opening and pulled, and the panel swung the rest of the way onto a darkness her phone light couldn't quite reach the end of. Not a wall, not a crawl space behind the plumbing. A room. She could feel the change in the air the second the gap opened wide enough to let it through. A room with its own held breath, its own decades of silence, waiting on the other side of a door that nobody alive had known was there. She leaned in as far as she dared without actually crossing the threshold, and swept the phone light slowly from one side to the other. The space was narrow, maybe 6 feet across, and it ran back further than the beam could confidently promise, swallowed by a darkness so complete it seemed to drink the light rather than simply block it. The floor looked to be poured concrete, unusual for a house this old, laid by someone who had wanted this particular room to survive things an ordinary cellar floor might not have to. Along the near wall, low to the ground, she caught the edge of something with a dull metallic sheen, there and gone again, as her hand shook and the beam slid past it before she could bring it back around. Not the bright glint she might have imagined if she'd let herself imagine anything at all. Something duller than that, something old. Beside her, Eli had gone very still, his toy car forgotten entirely on the pantry floor. "Are we going in there?" he whispered. Not scared exactly. Or not only scared, there was something else moving underneath it, the same wide-eyed hunger any 9-year-old would feel looking into a hole in a wall that clearly wasn't supposed to be there. Treasure map logic taking over before caution had a chance to catch up. "I don't know yet, baby." She meant it. Her hand had found his shoulder without her telling it to. Some old animal instinct to keep him close to her body, now that the night had turned into whatever this was. Mrs. Pearl said old Augusta hid things. His voice had dropped even lower, like the house itself might be listening. What if she hid it in there? Mara didn't answer him. She was still trying to answer that question for herself. Outside, closer now, she heard a car door slam, and then Gerald's voice carrying across the front yard toward the porch, unhurried, telling someone, maybe just himself, that this wouldn't take long. From somewhere in the front of the house, Pearl's voice called out, bright and unbothered, that she'd found Eli's shoe, and were they about ready, and there was a beat of silence after that, in which Mara understood that Pearl had also heard the truck, and was buying whatever seconds she could, without knowing why they were needed. Mara looked down at the open panel, at the darkness beyond it that her light still hadn't managed to fully claim, and then at Eli's face turned up toward hers, waiting for her to decide something he was too young to be asked to help decide. She had maybe 4 minutes before Gerald Pruitt was back on that porch with the sheriff's number already dialed, and in front of her was a doorway into the dark that a woman named Augusta Pruitt had sealed shut with her own 2 hands more than half a century ago, and Mara Doyle knelt there in the wreckage of her packed-up life with her son's hand tight in hers, and had to decide, in the space of a single breath, whether to close it back up and vanish into whatever came next, or step through. She stepped through. The floor on the other side was solid under her sneakers, cold poured concrete instead of the pantry's worn boards, and the air closed around her like something that had a weight to it, mineral and dry and untouched. She kept one hand back through the opening until Eli's fingers found it, and pulled him gently in after her, rather than leave him alone on the other side of a door that might, for all she knew yet, decide to swing shut behind them. The room ran back further than her phone light wanted to admit. 6 feet across, maybe 14 deep, with a low ceiling she could touch if she reached up, and along the near wall, a workbench she recognized instantly for what it was, even though she had never set foot in a jeweler's shop in her life. Something in the shape of it, the neat rows of small drawers built into the front, the swing-arm lamp bolted to one corner with its bulb long since burned out. A stool sat pushed in beneath it, a cardigan still draped over the back of the chair, as if the woman who'd worn it had simply stepped away for a moment, 55 years ago, and never quite gotten around to coming back. On the bench itself sat two wooden trays, lined in faded green felt, the kind Mara had only ever seen behind glass counters at the mall, and when she brought the light down across the first one, she had to bite back a sound that wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite a laugh, because it looked, for one disorienting second, like a child's game of pretend, gold coins arranged in careful rows, dozens of them, dulled by decades of stillness but unmistakably real, each one nested into its own felt cutout, like it had been placed there and never once disturbed. The second tray held stones instead of coins. Most were still rough, uncut, the kind of dull-coloured lumps that meant nothing to an untrained eye, except that they had been sorted with obvious care into paper envelopes labelled in a small, precise hand. But a few near the back had been cut and polished, catching what little light there was and throwing it back sharp and clean, even after all this time in the dark. Beyond the trays, in the deepest corner, sat a black steel document box the size of a bread box, its latch closed but not locked, and beside it, hanging from a nail driven into the wall, a small brass key that didn't seem to belong to anything Mara could see, unless it belonged to something she hadn't found yet. Along the workbench itself, tucked between the felt trays and a scattering of small brown envelopes, sat a single ring on a square of black cloth, set apart from everything else in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Mara picked it up without quite deciding to, an old-fashioned setting, a stone the size of a pencil eraser catching the light even through a film of dust, and turned it over to find two initials scratched into the inside of the band, so small she had to bring the phone light almost against the metal to read them. Not AP, a different set entirely, someone else's, and beneath them a tiny number that might have been a year or might have been something else, worn too faint now to be sure. She set it back down exactly where she'd found it, some instinct telling her that whatever story belonged to that ring wasn't hers to disturb any further tonight, not with Gerald's truck somewhere out on the road, and her own understanding of any of this still barely a minute old. "Mum," Eli's voice had gone small and strange, the voice of a kid trying to whisper and failing because there was too much feeling behind it to fit through a whisper. "Is this real?" "I don't know," she said, which was true, and knelt down in front of the steel box with her heart doing something that no longer felt like fear exactly, more like the sensation of standing at the top of a very tall drop, with no clear sense yet of whether she was about to fall or fly. She lifted the latch. Inside, resting on top of a stack of yellowed ledger pages bound in cracked leather, was an envelope, unsealed, the paper gone soft and brittle at the folds, with 4 words written across the front, in the same small, precise hand that had labelled the stone envelopes. "To whoever finds this." Mara had gotten as far as sliding the letter halfway out of its envelope, close enough to make out a date at the top in that same careful script, March of 1971, when she heard the front door of the house open above and behind her, and Gerald Pruitt's voice carrying through the kitchen, calling her name like a man who still believed he knew exactly what kind of night this was going to be. She had maybe 10 seconds. She used them to fold the letter, envelope and all, and push it down the front of her jacket before she turned to face the pantry doorway, Eli pressed close against her side, the open panel and the lit-up room behind them, impossible now to hide, unhide, or explain away as anything other than exactly what it was. Gerald appeared in the pantry doorway with his phone still in his hand, the sheriff's number no doubt still sitting there ready, and the sentence he'd clearly been about to say, something about the time, something about her boxes not being in her car yet, died somewhere in his throat the second his eyes found the hole in the wall behind her. "What?" he said, and stopped. He took one step closer, and the beam of Mara's flashlight, still hanging loose in her hand, caught the carved letters at the bottom corner of the fallen panel. AP. Something moved across Gerald Pruitt's face that Mara had never seen there before, not in 18 months of watching him be careful and cold and businesslike on this same porch and in this same front hall. For one unguarded second, he looked like a much younger man, standing in a kitchen that had belonged to his grandmother, hearing something he half remembered and had spent his whole life being told wasn't true. "That's not possible," he said, mostly to himself. "That's not." He looked at Mara like he was seeing her for the first time all night. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything. My son's toy rolled behind the shelf. We found it by accident." Her voice came out steadier than she expected, though her hands, down at her sides, were shaking hard enough that she had to make a fist to stop it. "Gerald, there's a letter. There's a whole room your grandmother built and sealed up, and I don't care what you think." The softness, whatever brief flicker of it had crossed his face a second before, closed over completely, replaced by something harder and faster moving, a man doing math in real time and not liking any of the answers. "This is my house. Every wall in it is mine. Whatever's back there belongs to me, and you are going to step away from it right now." "I'm not taking anything, Gerald. I'm not trying to steal from you. You broke into a wall in my house at 11 o'clock at night." He was already dialing, thumb-jabbing at the screen, his voice climbing into a register Mara hadn't heard from him before, something closer to panic than anger, though at the time she couldn't have said which of the two was actually driving him. "That's not an accident, that's breaking and entering, that's theft, and I've got half a mind to have you arrested for it instead of just evicted." A toy car rolled behind a shelf, Gerald. "My son found a hole in a wall. I didn't bring a crowbar to your house tonight looking for buried treasure. I was packing to leave, because you told me to be gone by midnight, and I am standing here telling you the truth even though I know exactly how it sounds." "It sounds," Gerald said, "like a woman who owes me $2,300 just found a way to make herself very rich very fast, and I am not about to stand in my own kitchen and let that happen without a fight. This isn't about the rent anymore, and you know it." Mara felt something in her chest go hot and steady all at once, the particular calm that sometimes arrives right on the far side of fear. "This is about a deadline you've got with a man named Emmerich, and you know I know that, because half this town's been talking about it for 2 weeks." For just a second, Gerald's composure cracked wide open, something raw and frightened showing through before he could get it hidden again, and Mara understood, watching it happen, that whatever came next between them was not going to be a fair fight fought in good faith on either side. "Get away from it," he said again, quieter now, which was somehow worse than the shouting. "Get away from it right now. Gerald Pruitt, you will lower your voice in this house." Pearl's voice cut through the kitchen from the hallway behind him, and a second later she appeared in the doorway herself, 71 years old, and half his size, and entirely unbothered by either fact. "I have known you since you were shorter than that boy standing right there, and I have never once seen you talk to another human being the way you are talking right now. You ought to be ashamed. Stay out of this, Pearl." "I will not." She planted herself in the narrow hallway, like she intended to hold it against an army. "You listen to me. Nobody broke into anything. A child's toy rolled behind a shelf, same as children's toys have been doing in this town since before either one of us was born, and what they found back there is not something you get to decide the meaning of just because your name happens to be on a deed." Gerald didn't answer her. He already had the phone to his ear, and the three of them stood there in a strange, tense silence, Eli's hand tight in Mara's, Pearl standing guard in the doorway, the open panel behind them all glowing faintly with the light Mara had left running inside it, until they heard him say, in a voice gone suddenly formal and controlled, that he needed a deputy out to 417 Birch Hollow Road, that there was a break-in situation, that it was still in progress. The deputy who pulled into the driveway 11 minutes later, lights on but no siren, was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s named Hollis, who had, by his own account given a few minutes into the visit, worked this stretch of Colworth for going on 16 years, and had never once in that time been called out to referee something quite like this. He listened to Gerald first, arms crossed, nodding slowly, and then he listened to Mara, and then, because Pearl inserted herself into the conversation whether anyone had asked her to or not, he listened to Pearl too, and by the time all three versions had been laid out in his kitchen, he had the particular weary expression of a man who understood that nothing about tonight was going to fit into any of the boxes on his usual paperwork. He crouched down at one point to Eli's level, which Mara noticed and appreciated more than she had words for right then, and asked the boy directly, in a gentle, unhurried voice, to walk him through exactly what had happened with the toy car. Eli did, seriously, methodically, the way he narrated most things that mattered to him, and Hollis listened to every word of it before he straightened back up and looked at Gerald with an expression that had hardened somewhat in the telling. "Nobody's under arrest," he said finally, holding up a hand before Gerald could get another sentence out. "Mr. Pruitt, I hear you saying theft, and what I'm looking at is a woman and a 9-year-old who found a hidden room in a wall while they were packing to leave, same as you told them to. That's not breaking and entering. That's not even close to it. It's my property, it's your property, and that room's been sealed inside it for longer than I've been alive, from the look of that dust," Hollis said, "which means figuring out who that stuff actually belongs to under the law is not something I'm equipped to settle standing in a pantry at midnight. That's a civil matter. That's a lawyer's job, maybe a judge's. What I can do tonight is make sure nobody touches anything else in that room until somebody with the authority to say who it belongs to has had a chance to look at it properly, and make sure everybody in this kitchen goes somewhere safe to sleep without anybody putting hands on anybody else. That's the whole of what I've got jurisdiction over right now." "And the eviction," Gerald said. "She still owes me $2,300 and change, and I told her to be out by midnight." Hollis looked at the clock on the stove, which read a few minutes past 12 already, and then at Mara, and something in his face suggested he had opinions about the timing of tonight's events that he was choosing not to share out loud. "Mr. Pruitt, you're welcome to pursue that through the proper eviction process, same as anybody, but I'll be honest with you, given what's sitting open in that wall back there, I'd think hard before I made a legal argument tonight that hinges on exactly which minute past midnight it currently is. A judge is going to ask why you were in such a hurry to clear this particular house." Gerald didn't have an answer for that. Mara watched something flicker across his face again, quick and sour, gone before she could name it for certain, though she would think about that look more than once in the days that followed. In the end, Hollis strung a strip of yellow tape across the pantry doorway, more symbolic than functional, and told both of them in plain terms to get lawyers, to touch nothing else, and to stay out of each other's way until somebody with actual authority sorted out who owned what. Gerald left first, jaw tight, phone already back in his hand, and Mara heard him on the porch steps telling someone, maybe his own lawyer, maybe just himself, that this changed everything. This changed absolutely everything. Pearl's offer from earlier that night was still standing, and this time Mara didn't argue with it. She and Eli spent what remained of that strange, sleepless night on Pearl's fold-out sofa bed, the letter still folded inside Mara's jacket where she'd hidden it, her thumb running over the edge of the envelope every few minutes, just to be sure it hadn't disappeared along with everything else that night that had felt too impossible to be real. She read it at 2 a.m. by the light of her phone, with Eli finally asleep beside her, his breathing slow and even in a way hers wasn't. "To whoever finds this," it began, in that same small, careful hand. "If you are reading these words, then I am gone, and the room has finally opened to someone who needed it enough to look. I built this space over the better part of 20 years, one visit at a time, because I could not trust my own son with what I had built with my own 2 hands, and because I had watched, more than once, what happens to a thing of value when it passes into the keeping of someone who has never learnt to want anything except more of it. I do not say that easily. He is my son. I loved him the way a mother loves a child, even when she has stopped being able to trust him with anything that matters, and that is its own particular grief, one I do not wish on the person reading this, whoever you are. What is in this room is not a fortune I am leaving to be fought over. It is a fortune I spent my whole working life building, coin by coin and stone by stone, out of a shop most people in this town thought was barely staying afloat, because I never let anyone see what I was actually doing with what came through that door. I want it to go to whoever finds it while standing in this house with nowhere else to go, because that is what it was always for. Not to sit in a bank vault making some stranger richer. To be the thing that catches a person who has fallen as far as a person can fall and still get back up. I had this letter witnessed and notarized on the 3rd of March 1971 by Harlan Voss, Notary Public of Ashcombe County, so that it would carry whatever weight the law allows an old woman's wishes to carry, even from this far away. I do not know if that will be enough. I hope it is. If it is not, I hope whoever reads this finds their own way to make it matter regardless. Take care of this house. Take care of whoever you love inside it. And if my son, or anyone claiming to speak for him, ever tells you that this belongs to him simply because his name is on a piece of paper somewhere, you tell them that I said no. I said it in 1971, and I am saying it again now, however many years later this finds you. Augusta Pruitt Mara read it 3 times before she could make herself stop, and on the 3rd reading she cried, muffling the sound against her sleeve so she wouldn't wake Eli, for reasons she couldn't have fully explained to anyone, grief and disbelief and something that felt dangerously, achingly close to hope, all tangled together into one feeling too large for a fold-out couch in a dark room at 2 in the morning. She thought, staring at the ceiling long after the letter had gone still in her hands, about Danny's coffee can of 20s in the hall closet, about how small an emergency fund had felt even at the time it was all they had, and about a woman 55 years dead who had built something so much larger out of the same basic fear that the people left behind could be caught with nothing the second the ground shifted under them. She did not know yet whether any part of what was hidden 6 inches from her old pantry shelf would ever legally belong to her, but she knew, lying there with Eli's breathing slow and even beside her, that she was not going to let it slip back into the dark without a fight, not for herself, and not for a woman she had never met, who had clearly spent a very long time hoping somebody like her would eventually come along. Getting Eli to school on time the next morning felt like performing a magic trick with no rehearsal. Pearl lent them both toothbrushes and a hairbrush, made scrambled eggs like it was any ordinary Wednesday, and stood on her front porch waving them off with a normalcy so complete that Mara almost believed it herself for the length of the drive. Eli was quiet in the back seat, turning something over in his head, and it wasn't until they were 2 blocks from the school that he finally asked the question that had clearly been sitting in him since they'd woken up. "Are we rich now?" "I don't know, baby. Maybe, maybe not. There's a lot that has to happen first. Lawyers and judges and paperwork, and none of it is fast. Are we going to have to move away from Colworth?" "I don't know that either." She caught his eyes in the rearview mirror at the stoplight. "What I do know is that whatever happens, you and me are going to be okay. That part isn't up for a judge to decide." He considered that with the particular gravity of a 9-year-old weighing a promise against everything he'd learned in the last 11 months about how promises sometimes didn't hold. "Can I tell my friends about the room?" "Not yet. Not until Miss Castillo says it's okay. Can you keep a secret that big for a little while?" "I kept the car under the bed a secret for 2 years," he said, with the wounded dignity of someone whose competence was being unfairly questioned, and Mara laughed for what felt like the first time in days, a real laugh, startled out of her before she could stop it, right there at a red light 2 blocks from Colworth Elementary. She called Deb the moment she was back in the car, sitting in the school pickup lane with a cup of Pearl's coffee going cold in the cup holder, and told her everything in a rush that probably made less sense out loud than it had in her own head. Deb was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and then she said the thing Mara needed to hear most, which was not a question about whether any of it was really true, but a name. "You need to call Renee Castillo," Deb said. "She helped my cousin's family when their landlord tried to pull something ugly a couple years back, some mess with a security deposit and a lease he claimed didn't exist. She's sharp, and she doesn't back down, and I don't think she charges people up front who don't have it to spend." Renee Castillo's office turned out to be a converted house 2 blocks off Main Street, a hand-lettered sign in the front window, a waiting room with exactly 4 chairs, and a space heater working overtime against the October chill. Renee herself was somewhere in her 40s, dark hair pulled back, reading glasses pushed up into it, and she listened to Mara's account of the previous night without interrupting once, taking notes in a looping hand on a yellow legal pad, until Mara got to the part about the letter and slid it, carefully, across the desk. Renee read it twice. When she looked up, there was something in her expression that hadn't been there a few minutes before, a kind of focus that made Mara sit up a little straighter in her chair. "Do you have any idea what you're holding here?" Renee asked. "A letter from a dead woman I never met. You're holding a 1971 holographic document, in her own handwriting, notarized and witnessed, expressing a clear and specific testamentary intent." Renee tapped the page. "I don't know yet whether a judge is going to treat this as a valid will, a valid codicil, or something closer to a gift with conditions, and that's going to take real research to sort out properly. But I can tell you right now that this is not nothing, and anyone who tells you it's nothing is either not a real lawyer or is working for the other side. Gerald's going to fight this. Gerald is going to fight this very hard, because from where he's sitting, this letter is standing between him and whatever deal he's got lined up with that developer, and men in that position rarely step aside without a fight." Renee set down her pen. "I'll take your case. I want a small retainer if you can manage it, even $100, because I've learned over the years that clients take things more seriously when they've got some skin in it too. But the bulk of my fee is going to come out of whatever we recover, if we recover anything at all." That's the honest version. "I'm not going to promise you a number today." "I don't need a number today," Mara said, and meant it. "I need someone who believes this is real. I believe the letter is real. I believe your account of last night is real. Whether a court agrees with either of those things is a different question, and I'd be doing you a disservice if I told you the answer was obvious." Renee leaned back in her chair, studying Mara for a moment before she went on. "There's actually a whole separate body of law we might lean on even without the letter, if it comes to that. Most states recognize something close to a treasure trove doctrine, property intentionally hidden by someone who's since died or can't be found, as opposed to something merely lost. The finder's rights against a landlord can be stronger than people assume, especially where the landlord had no knowledge the item existed and never searched for it himself. Combine that with a documented letter naming an intended recipient, and we've actually got two separate legal theories pointing the same direction. That's a good position to argue from, even if neither one alone is a sure thing. Can I tell you something? I grew up 2 streets over from a woman, not unlike the one who wrote this letter. Everybody in the neighborhood thought she was just a strange old widow who kept to herself. Turned out she'd been funding a scholarship for kids in the district for 11 years without telling a soul, and she'd done it entirely through a bank 3 towns away, specifically so nobody local would ever connect her name to it. I have a soft spot for women like that. I won't pretend otherwise, and I won't pretend it doesn't affect how hard I'm going to work on this." Mara felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight since the moment Gerald's phone had lit up on that porch 2 nights before. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Thank me after the hearing." Renee was already reaching for her phone. "First thing we need is an emergency order preventing Mr. Pruitt from entering that room, removing anything from it, or altering the property in any way until this gets sorted. I can have that filed by end of day. Second thing, we need someone qualified to document and authenticate whatever's actually back there, someone with real credentials, because if this ends up in front of a judge, I want an expert's name on that inventory, not just yours and mine. I don't know anyone like that." "I do." Renee was already dialing. "Ruth Callahan runs the Ashcombe County Historical Society, and if there's anyone in 3 counties who'd recognize the name Augusta Pruitt on site, it's her. She's been trying to get someone to donate old Pruitt shop records to the archive for years. I have a feeling she's about to get her wish in a much bigger way than she expected." The emergency order came through by Thursday afternoon, and with it, a court-appointed window for a supervised inspection of the room. Renee on one side, Gerald's newly retained lawyer, a sharp-featured man named Foster Lang, on the other, and Ruth Callahan standing between them both, with a headlamp, cotton gloves, and an expression of barely contained wonder that Mara recognized because she had worn roughly the same expression herself 3 nights before. Ruth was somewhere in her 60s, silver hair cropped short, the kind of woman who talked with her hands even when the hands in question were currently sheathed in white cotton gloves. She knelt in front of the first felt tray for a long moment without saying anything at all, and when she finally spoke, her voice had gone soft in a way that made the whole cramped little room feel briefly like a church. "Pruitt's Jewelry and Repair," she said. "Main Street, between the old Five and Dime and what's now the insurance office. Closed in 1971. I have 3 photographs of that storefront in the archive, and I have spent 20 years wondering what actually happened to Augusta Pruitt's inventory when she died, because the estate records I've seen list almost nothing of real value, which never made sense to me given how long she operated and how well regarded her repair work was across the whole county." She looked up at Mara, eyes bright behind her glasses. "I think you may have just answered a question I've been asking since before you were born, young lady." Foster Lang stood in the pantry doorway through most of that first inspection, arms folded, saying little beyond the occasional objection about the pace or the handling procedure, and Mara noticed that Gerald himself had not come. He'd sent his lawyer instead, and something about that absence, whether it was shame or strategy or simple avoidance, sat with Mara the whole rest of that afternoon in a way she couldn't quite name. "This ring," Ruth said at one point, lifting the piece Mara had found and set carefully back down that first night, turning it beneath her headlamp. "This isn't Augusta's. Look at the setting style. It's a good decade older than most of what's in these trays. My guess, and it's only a guess until I can dig further, is that this came in for repair sometime in the 1940s or 50s and was never picked up. Customers did that more than people realize, moved away, died, simply forgot. A careful jeweler would have written down every detail of anything unclaimed. Che quote. She glanced toward the steel document box. If those ledgers back up that theory, this piece may legally belong to someone else's descendants entirely, which is its own complication, and an honest one worth sorting out properly, rather than letting it get swept into whatever else happens here. "You'd tell us that," Foster Lang said from the doorway, "even though it might shrink the number you're about to hand my client's opponent." "I'd tell you that," Ruth said, without looking up from the tray, "because I have spent my entire career trying to get things back to the people they actually belong to, Mr. Lang, and that includes situations where the answer is inconvenient for everybody in the room. I'd think carefully before you imply otherwise again." Over the following days, working under the terms of the court order, Ruth catalogued the room piece by piece, coin by coin, envelope by envelope, cross-referencing what she found against decades-old newspaper mentions, county tax filings, and a slim self-published local history that devoted exactly one paragraph to the eccentric widow who ran the jewelry shop and kept mostly to herself. The ledger from the steel document box turned out to be the real key, a running account in Augusta's own hand of purchases and appraisals stretching back to 1934. Gold bought steadily, and without a word to anyone, through the leanest years of the Depression, when most people were selling rather than buying, stones acquired from estate sales and traveling dealers, at prices that read, even accounting for the era, like the work of someone who understood exactly what she was doing. Buried in one of the later ledger pages, dated the autumn of 1968, Ruth found the entry that would end up mattering more than almost anything else in that room. "Walter came by the shop again today," it read, in Augusta's careful hand. "Asked to borrow against the register receipts, same as March. I told him no. He took my father's pocket watch from the display case while my back was turned, and I have not seen it since. I will not report my own son to the sheriff. But I understand now, in a way I did not before, that I cannot leave anything in this town where his hands can reach it. I am going to build somewhere they cannot. That's your motive, right there, in her own words," Renee said, when Ruth brought her a photograph of the page, dated 3 years before the letter itself. "This isn't a woman acting on a whim in her final days. This is a documented, years-long pattern of protecting what she'd built from one specific person, culminating in a formal, witnessed letter. That's about as strong a record of clear testamentary intent as I've ever seen in a case like this." By the time Ruth's initial catalogue was complete, the tally ran to 211 gold coins, mostly American eagles and double eagles, but with a scattering of foreign mint marks mixed through, 43 loose gemstones in various stages of cutting, 62 pieces of finished jewelry, and a small bundle of silver certificates from the 1930s, still bound with a paper strip gone brittle with age. She wasn't hoarding by accident either way, Ruth told Renee and Mara, spreading photographs of the ledger pages across Renee's desk a week into the inspection. This was decades of deliberate acquisition by someone with real expertise, someone who watched the market the way another person might watch the weather. My preliminary estimate, and I want to stress this is preliminary, is that you are looking at a collection in the neighborhood of $124 million, and that number could move once everything is properly appraised piece by piece. Mara had to ask her to repeat it, and then had to sit down, because her legs had stopped being entirely reliable. 124 million, Renee said, watching Mara's face. Give or take. News like that did not stay contained inside a lawyer's office in a town the size of Colworth, not even under a court-appointed confidentiality order, and within a week the story had travelled from Deb's cousin's chair to the diner counter to the checkout line at the grocery on Fifth, growing a little with every retelling the way stories in small towns always did. By the time it reached Mr. Abernathy at the diner one Friday morning, it had become a version where Mara had found actual bars of gold bullion stacked to the ceiling, which wasn't true, though Mara found she didn't have the energy to correct every version she overheard. Frank Mercer, of all people, put her back on the schedule for 4 full shifts a week, without being asked. And when she pointed out that nothing about her financial situation had actually changed yet, not legally, not really, he'd just shrugged and said the diner could use a server people wanted to come in and see. Pearl took the news the way Pearl took most things, with a brief, fierce hug, and then immediately a list of practical concerns. You'll want a second lawyer eventually, one who does nothing but taxes, because whatever number ends up being real is going to come with its own headaches attached, she said, setting a plate of cornbread down in front of Mara, at the kitchen table, like the conversation were about something considerably smaller than $124 million. And you'll want to think hard about what you actually want your life to look like on the other side of this, because money has a way of arriving faster than people are ready for it, and I've seen what that does to a person who hasn't given it any thought beforehand. She sat down across from Mara with her own cup of tea. I don't say that to scare you. I say it because I intend to still be your neighbor when all this settles, one way or the other, and I'd like you to still be someone I recognize. I don't think I know who I'll be on the other side of this either, Mara admitted. Nobody ever does, dear. You just try to keep the parts of yourself worth keeping and let the rest sort itself out. Pearl reached across the table and squeezed her hand once, brisk and certain, before getting back up to check on the eggs. Now eat something. You've got a fight ahead of you, and fights go better on a full stomach. Gerald Pruitt did not take the news well. Foster Lang filed a response within days arguing that the 1971 letter, whatever its sentimental value, had never been probated, had never been part of any recognized estate proceeding, and could not now, more than half a century later, be used to override the clear and undisputed chain of legal ownership that ran from Augusta Pruitt to Walter Pruitt to Gerald Pruitt himself. Whatever sat in that room, the filing argued, was found on Gerald's property, inside Gerald's walls, and belonged as a simple matter of real property law to Gerald. He's not wrong that it's a real legal question, Renee admitted, going over the filing with Mara in her office. Ownership of found property inside a structure is genuinely contested territory, and a lot of it depends on facts we're still building out. But he's leaning awfully hard on the idea that a 55-year-old letter, notarized and witnessed, expressing a specific intent that this not go to his own father, simply doesn't count for anything. I don't think a judge is going to find that argument as clean as he wants it to be." End quote. There was more going on underneath Gerald's sudden aggression than the letter alone, as it turned out. Renee's paralegal, digging through public filings that same week, found the paperwork on Gerald's refinanced mortgages, the failed car wash venture from 4 years back, and a pending sale agreement with Dale Emmerich's development company that included a financing contingency set to expire at the end of October, a deadline that was now, thanks to the emergency order freezing the property, going to be very difficult for Gerald to meet. He's not just angry about the money in that room, Renee said. He needed this house sold, clean and empty, inside the next few weeks, or his whole financial position was about to come apart. Now there's an injunction on the property, a legal cloud over the title, and a $124 million dispute sitting in the middle of it. From where he's standing, you didn't just find his grandmother's fortune, you blew up the one deal that was going to keep him solvent. Mara thought about that for a long moment, sitting in Renee's cramped little office with Eli's school pickup time creeping closer on the clock behind her. That almost makes me feel sorry for him. Almost, Renee agreed. Though I'd point out that a man who was about to be foreclosed on had every reason to search that house himself, over however many years he's owned it, and either never thought to look, or looked and never found it. Either way, that's not your problem to solve, Mara. Your job right now is showing up to a hearing in 3 weeks and telling the truth as plainly and clearly as you can. I'll handle the rest of it. Gerald caught her outside the Ferncrest Diner on a Thursday evening, waiting by her car in the half-empty lot with his hands shoved into his coat pockets, and Mara's first instinct, seeing him there in the dark, was to turn around and go back inside. She didn't. She'd promised herself, somewhere over the last 2 weeks, that she wasn't going to be the one flinching anymore. "You don't have to do this," he said, without any greeting first. "The court fight, the lawyer, all of it. I'd be willing to settle. $15,000, cash, and you walk away clean. No more back rent owed, no more eviction on your record. You could start over somewhere with money in your pocket instead of a pile of legal bills and a judge who might not even side with you. $15,000 out of $124 million. Mara kept her voice level, though her heart was going hard against her ribs. "That's what you think this is worth to me. I think you're a woman with $400 in the bank being told by a lawyer that she might win a fortune, and I think that lawyer isn't the one who has to explain to her kid why they're still sleeping on somebody's couch a year from now if the judge sides with me instead." Something in his face had gone almost pleading, though Mara couldn't tell anymore how much of it was genuine and how much was simple desperation dressed up to look like concern. "I'm not the villain here, Mara. I'm a man trying to keep what's mine. Your grandmother wrote 55 years ago that it was never going to be yours." Mara opened her car door, done with the conversation before he was. "I think I'll take my chances with the judge." The hearing date came back from the court clerk's office on a Tuesday, set for the middle of November, and with it a formal notice that Gerald Pruitt was seeking not only a ruling on ownership of the room's contents, but an order requiring Mara to vacate the property immediately, treating the whole discovery, in the language of his filing, as an unauthorized alteration of the premises by a tenant already in material breach of her lease. "He's trying to solve 2 problems with one filing," Renee said, reading it over with her jaw tight. "Get you out of the house and get the room's contents declared his, both at once, before the letter gets a real hearing on its own merits. It's aggressive, it's also a little bit desperate, which tells me his financial situation is worse than even I first thought." Mara sat across from her, Eli's backpack slung over her shoulder, because she'd come straight from school pickup, and tried to hold on to the strange, unsteady feeling that had been living in her chest for nearly 2 weeks now, equal parts terror, and something that almost felt like the beginning of hope. "Can we win this?" she asked. Renee was quiet for a moment, choosing her words the careful way lawyers do when they've learned the cost of promising more than they can deliver. "I think we have a real case," she said finally. "I think Augusta Pruitt wrote that letter so that someone, someday, would be standing exactly where you're standing right now, asking exactly that question. Whether a judge in 3 weeks sees it the same way we do, I honestly can't tell you yet. What I can tell you is that we are going to walk into that courtroom with everything she left behind, and we are going to make him work a great deal harder than he expected to take it away from you." Mara drove home to Pearl's that evening, with Eli asleep against the window in the back seat, his homework folder still open on his lap, and pulled into the driveway a long time before she made herself go inside. 3 weeks. She sat there with the engine ticking as it cooled, looking at the lit-up front window where Pearl was almost certainly already setting a 4th plate at the table without being asked, and thought about a woman she had never met who had spent 20 years building something in secret, coin by coin, stone by stone, out of nothing but the stubborn conviction that it mattered who a thing ended up belonging to. 3 weeks, and then a courtroom, and then, one way or another, an answer. She woke Eli gently, walked him inside, and did not let herself think, not that night, about what it would mean to lose. Old Augusta had said, "Take care of whoever you love inside it," and Mara held on to that line more than any other over the 3 weeks that followed, turning it over in her head, the way Eli turned his matchbox car over in his palm at night before he slept, like something small enough to hold on to when everything else about the situation felt too large to fully grasp. Renee Castillo's office grew busier as November crept closer. There were depositions to schedule, an appraiser flown in from 2 states over to examine the coins under conditions a local jeweler couldn't offer, phone calls with a probate specialist Renee brought on as co-counsel, once it became clear the case had grown well past the scope of a single small-town practice. Mara sat through most of these meetings with Eli's school folder balanced on her knee, learning a vocabulary she had never expected to need: holographic will, testamentary intent, chain of custody. She wrote the words down in the back of a notebook she'd bought for exactly this purpose, the way she used to write down grocery lists, because it helped to see the shape of a thing on paper, instead of just carrying it around loose in her head. Ruth Callahan finished her full catalogue 9 days before the hearing, 3-ring binders thick, every coin photographed and weighed, every gemstone measured and graded by a certified appraiser she'd brought in from the state capitol, every page of Augusta's ledger transcribed and cross-referenced against newspaper archives and county tax records going back to 1934. She delivered the binders to Renee's office in person, setting them down on the desk with the particular care of someone handling something she considered sacred. "I've spent 2 decades wondering what happened to this collection," Ruth said, and there was something almost apologetic in how she said it, as if she felt she owed Mara an explanation for caring this much about a stranger's grandmother. "I used to drive past that storefront on Main Street and try to picture what the shop looked like when it was open. Now I know. I know more about Augusta Pruitt than I know about most of my own relatives." She looked at Mara for a long moment. "Whatever happens in that courtroom, I want you to know I believe she meant every word of that letter. I've read a great many old documents in my career. Most of them are business as usual, deeds and receipts and dry legal language. That letter isn't that. That letter is a woman telling the truth about her own life because she'd run out of other ways to protect it." Unquote. Ruth traced the 2 scratched initials, a J and an F, to a repair ticket recorded in Augusta's earliest ledger, dated the spring of 1952, a customer named Franklin Osei, who had brought in his late wife's engagement ring for a new prong setting and never returned to collect it. Ruth found the man's grandson 2 counties over through an old church directory, a retired postal worker named Curtis Osei, who wept quietly on his porch when Ruth showed him the photograph. Because he'd grown up hearing about a ring nobody in the family could ever explain the loss of, his grandmother's own words passed down through 3 generations, that it had simply vanished somewhere between a jewelry shop and a marriage that lasted 41 years. "That ring isn't part of any dispute," Renee told Mara, going over the final case strategy the week before the hearing. "It goes back to the Osei family, regardless of what the judge decides about the rest. I want that stated plainly in the courtroom, because it matters. It shows the court that we're not trying to claim everything with our hands out. It shows good faith," and quote her. Foster Lang, for his part, had spent the 3 weeks building a different kind of argument, one that had nothing to do with sentiment. His filings leaned entirely on statute, on the plain language of Ashcombe County property law, on decades of precedent establishing that whatever was found within the 4 walls of a structure belonged, absent some other overriding claim, to whoever held clear legal title to that structure. He filed a motion to have the 1971 letter excluded from evidence entirely, arguing it had never been properly probated as a will within the statutory window and therefore carried no more legal weight than a diary entry. Renee fought that motion for 4 days straight and won, but only barely. And the judge's ruling allowing the letter in came with a warning that its ultimate weight would still be for the court to decide at the actual hearing. Gerald himself grew harder to read as the date approached. Deb reported, through the same hairdresser's chair grapevine that had first surfaced the Emmerich deal, that his financing window with the developer had come and gone entirely, the deal collapsed under the weight of the property injunction, and that he'd been seen twice at the bank in the middle of the day, looking like a man rehearsing a conversation he badly did not want to have. Mara felt no satisfaction hearing it. Mostly she felt tired, the particular exhaustion of watching two people's desperation grind against each other with nothing gentle left in either direction. He came to see her one more time before the hearing, on a grey Sunday afternoon, standing in Pearl's driveway, with his hands shoved in his coat pockets the same way he had outside the diner weeks before, except something in his posture had changed, the aggression worn down to something closer to plain fatigue. "I'm not here to threaten you," he said, before Mara could say anything at all. "I know how that sounds coming from me. I just wanted to say it plain, before Tuesday. Whatever happens in that courtroom, I never wanted things to go the way they went that night. I wasn't lying when I said I've got a mortgage and expenses of my own. I wasn't lying about any of it. I just never once thought about what it would look like from where you were standing. I think I've been thinking about that a lot the last few weeks, whether I like thinking about it or not." "I believe you," Mara said, and found, a little to her own surprise, that she meant it. "I think you're a man who got squeezed by his own choices and decided it was easier to squeeze somebody else than sit with that. I don't think that makes you a monster, Gerald. I think it makes you like a lot of people I've met this year. I just don't think it entitles you to what's in that room." He didn't have an answer for that. He nodded once, got back in his truck, and drove off into the grey afternoon, and Mara stood in the driveway a long time after the taillights disappeared, feeling something she hadn't expected to feel toward the man who had stood on her porch a month earlier, with a phone already lit up and ready to call the sheriff. Not forgiveness exactly, something closer to the specific, tired mercy of a person who had learned, over the last 11 months, just how thin the line could be between a person doing something unforgivable and a person simply doing the only thing they could see how to do. The hearing was set for a Tuesday morning in the second week of November, in the Ashcombe County Courthouse, a squat brick building 3 blocks off Main Street that Mara had driven past 1,000 times without ever once imagining she'd walk through its doors for a reason like this one. She wore the same black dress she'd borrowed from Deb for Danny's funeral, the only formal thing she owned, and stood in the hallway outside the courtroom with Renee running through last-minute notes in a low voice, while Pearl sat with Eli on a bench nearby, having pulled him out of school for the day on the theory, as she put it, that some lessons only came around once in a life, and a courtroom watching his mother fight for a dead woman's promise was one of them. Judge Miriam Okonkwo-Hale presided, a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight knot, and a reputation, Renee had told Mara beforehand, for running a courtroom with almost no patience for theatrics, and considerably more patience for careful, well-documented argument. She read through both filings before either lawyer said a word, glasses pushed low on her nose, the courtroom silent except for the occasional cough from the small gallery of townspeople who had come to watch, Deb among them, and Mr. Abernathy from the diner, and even Frank Mercer, who had closed the diner for 2 hours that morning without a single word of complaint about the lost revenue. Foster Lang went first, laying out his argument with the flat, methodical confidence of a man who believed the law was fundamentally on his side. He walked the court through the deed history of 417 Birch Hollow Road, the clean and undisputed chain of title running from Augusta Pruitt to her son Walter to her grandson Gerald, and argued that whatever sat behind that pantry wall had passed along with the house itself, the same as the plumbing or the roof shingles, regardless of any letter its previous owner might have written more than half a century ago and never taken the legal steps to properly execute. "Mr. Pruitt does not dispute that his grandmother wrote this letter," Lang said, gesturing toward the photocopy sitting in evidence. "He does not dispute her right, at the time, to feel however she felt about her son. What he disputes is the notion that a private, unprobated letter, discovered by a stranger 55 years after the fact, can somehow override the clean legal chain of ownership that has governed this property and been recognized by this very county across 3 generations of the Pruitt family." Renee rose next, and Mara watched her walk to the center of the courtroom with the same steady, unhurried focus she'd brought to every meeting in her cramped little office over the past 3 weeks. "Your Honor, Opposing counsel is correct that this letter was never formally probated, she began. He is also correct that ownership of real property, absent other circumstances, generally follows clean title. But this case does not rest on real property law alone, and I would ask the court to consider two separate and independently sufficient grounds. She walked the judge through the treasure trove doctrine first, the long-established legal principle that items intentionally concealed by someone since deceased, discovered by a person with no prior knowledge of their existence, carry a distinct legal status from items merely lost or misplaced, and that a landlord's claim to such items, where the landlord neither knew of their existence nor made any effort to search for them across decades of ownership, was considerably weaker than the mere fact of holding a deed might suggest. Mr. Pruitt owned this property for years before Miss Doyle ever moved in, Renee said. He never searched behind that pantry wall. He never had reason to believe anything was there. It was discovered, entirely by accident, by a 9-year-old boy's toy car, in the course of an eviction Mr. Pruitt himself initiated, with an aggressive midnight deadline. The law does not reward passive ownership over active discovery in circumstances like these, and I would ask the court to weigh that carefully." End quote. Then she turned to the letter itself, and this was where Mara felt the whole courtroom lean forward slightly, even the gallery, even Judge Okonkwo Hale herself. "Your Honor, whether or not this letter meets the statutory requirements for a formal will is, I would argue, almost beside the point," Renee said. "What this letter establishes, beyond any reasonable dispute, is Augusta Pruitt's clear, documented, years-long intent regarding the disposition of this collection. This was not a whim scribbled in a moment of anger. I would direct the court's attention to Exhibit 14, a ledger entry dated 3 full years before the letter itself, in which Augusta Pruitt documents, in her own hand, an incident in which her son Walter stole his own father's pocket watch from her shop, and her explicit statement that she understood, from that moment forward, that she could not leave anything in this town where his hands could reach it. That is not a passing sentiment. That is a woman building, over decades, toward a specific and deliberate purpose, culminating in a formal, witnessed, notarized letter naming her intent with total clarity. Whatever this document's precise legal category, Your Honor, its authenticity and its intent are not seriously in dispute, and I would ask the court to weigh that intent heavily against a claim resting on nothing more than the fact that a name happens to appear on a deed." Ruth Callahan testified next, walking the court through her catalogue with the same careful, unhurried authority she'd brought to the inspection itself: the ledger pages, the newspaper archives, the tax filings, laying out a picture of Augusta Pruitt so thorough and so specific that by the time she finished, the woman who had once been little more than a name carved into a piece of wood felt, to everyone in that courtroom, like someone they had actually known. "In 20 years of local historical research," Ruth said, near the end of her testimony, "I have encountered a great many old documents claiming significance they don't actually carry. This is not one of those." Augusta Pruitt kept meticulous records for nearly 40 years. Every purchase, every appraisal, every repair, documented in the same hand, the same voice, the same precision, right up through the final ledger entry, dated 2 weeks before her death. A woman who kept records that carefully did not write a letter like this one carelessly. She wrote it exactly the way she wrote everything else in her life, with intention. Deputy Hollis testified about the night itself, plain and unembellished, confirming what he had already put in his report weeks before, that nothing about the discovery suggested any prior knowledge or premeditation on Mara's part, that a child's toy car and a curious hand reaching into a gap behind a shelf were, in his considerable experience, about as far from breaking and entering as a person could get. Then it was Mara's turn. She had rehearsed this moment with Renee more times than she could count, had lain awake more than one night in Pearl's spare room running through the questions she expected, but none of that preparation quite prepared her for the actual weight of standing at the front of a courtroom with Eli watching from the gallery, his hand tucked into Pearl's, his eyes fixed on her with an expression she recognized, the same stubborn, hopeful attention he brought to anything he'd decided mattered. Renee's questions were gentle, walking Mara through the night itself, the eviction, the toy car, the panel giving way beneath her hands. It was Foster Lang's cross-examination that Mara had braced hardest for, and it came exactly as sharp as she'd expected. "Ms. Doyle, isn't it true that you owed my client $2,350 in back rent at the time of this discovery?" "Yes. And isn't it true that finding $124 million behind a pantry wall would solve that problem rather conveniently for you?" "Objection," Renee said, before Mara could answer. "Argumentative. I'll allow the witness to answer," Judge Okonkwo-Hale said, though something in her tone suggested she wasn't especially impressed with the question either. Mara looked at Foster Lang, and then, deliberately, past him, toward the gallery, toward Eli's face turned up and watching, and when she answered, her voice came out steadier than she expected it to. "It would solve a lot more than that problem for me, Mr. Lang, but I didn't go looking for a fortune that night. I went looking for my son's toy car, because it mattered to him, and because in the middle of the worst night of the last 11 months of my life, that felt like the one small thing I could still fix. Everything else that happened because a woman I never met spent 20 years building something she hoped would matter to somebody exactly like me, someday, in exactly this kind of trouble. I didn't plan any of it. I just didn't walk away from it once it was in front of me. I'm not sure I could have, even if I'd wanted to." Lang tried a few more angles, pressing on the timing of the discovery relative to the eviction deadline, on whether Mara had ever suspected anything unusual about the pantry before that night, on whether she stood to benefit financially from exaggerating the significance of what she'd found. Mara answered each question plainly, without flourish, and by the time he sat back down, something in the energy of the courtroom had settled, the particular quiet that comes when a room has decided, whether or not it's said aloud yet, which way it believes the truth actually points. Gerald testified last, and Mara watched him take the stand with an unexpected knot of something close to sympathy still sitting in her chest from their conversation in Pearl's driveway. He answered Lang's questions in a flat, careful voice, laying out his financial pressures, the refinanced mortgages, the failed car wash venture, the pending Emmerich deal, framing all of it as the ordinary, understandable burden of a man trying to hold on to what was legally his. Renee's cross-examination was shorter than Lang's had been with Mara, but it landed harder. "Mr. Pruitt, you testified that you needed this property vacated and sold quickly due to financial pressures related to a pending development deal. Isn't it true that your eviction notice to Ms. Doyle set a deadline of midnight on a Tuesday, rather than the standard notice period required under Ashcombe County law? I gave her plenty of warning before that, months of it." "That's not quite my question, Mr. Pruitt. Isn't it true that the specific deadline you gave her that night, midnight, was set to create maximum pressure, with full knowledge that she had a 9-year-old child and nowhere immediately arranged to go?" Gerald was quiet for a moment. "I needed the house empty." "And isn't it also true, Mr. Pruitt, that in the 4 years you have owned this property, you never once conducted any inspection of the pantry area, never noticed any discrepancy in its dimensions relative to the rest of the house, despite this discrepancy being, according to Miss Callahan's testimony, measurable by anyone with a tape measure? I never had reason to think there was anything to find." "No further questions," Renee said, and sat back down, and Mara understood, watching the judge's face as Gerald stepped down from the stand, that whatever was coming next had probably already been decided somewhere behind those careful, unreadable eyes. Closing arguments ran through the better part of an hour. Judge Okonkwo-Hale announced she would take the matter under advisement and issue a written ruling within 2 weeks rather than deciding from the bench, which Renee had warned Mara was fairly standard for a case with this much documentary evidence to weigh, but which still left Mara sitting in the courthouse parking lot afterward with her hands shaking on the steering wheel, the same particular exhaustion she remembered from the bank parking lot weeks before, except this time, underneath it, something that felt almost like relief simply at having said the truth out loud in a room where it mattered. The 2 weeks that followed were, in their own way, harder than the 3 that had come before, because there was nothing left to prepare for and nothing to do but wait. Mara went back to her diner shifts. Eli went back to school, carrying his secret with the same fierce competence he'd promised he could manage. Pearl kept feeding them both dinner every night, without ever once making it feel like charity. And some evenings, after Eli was asleep, Mara sat at Pearl's kitchen table with the photocopy of Augusta's letter in front of her, reading it again and again, trying to imagine the woman who had written it, alone in a back room behind a jewelry shop, building something coin by coin against a fear she'd never told anyone the full shape of until the very end. The ruling came on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by email to Renee's office while Mara was mid-shift at the diner, and Renee called her at the counter with a voice tight enough that Mara's stomach dropped before a single word of the actual content came through. "Come by the office when you're off," Renee said. "I don't want to read this to you over the phone." Mara worked the rest of that shift in a fog, pouring coffee and carrying plates with her hands not entirely steady, Deb watching her from across the counter with an expression that offered no reassurance because there wasn't any Deb could honestly give. She picked Eli up early from Pearl's, told him only that they were going to hear the judge's decision, and drove to Renee's office with her son's hand gripped in hers the whole walk from the car. Renee met them in the waiting room this time instead of her desk, the printed ruling in her hands, and the look on her face, once Mara finally made herself study it properly, was not the look of someone about to deliver bad news. "She ruled in our favor," Renee said. "Not entirely on the letter, though the court found it authentic and gave it substantial weight as evidence of intent. Mostly she ruled on the treasure trove doctrine, exactly the way I'd hoped she would. Her opinion is 31 pages. I'll read you the parts that matter most." She sat them both down and read through it slowly, Judge Okonkwo Hale's careful, unhurried language laying out a finding that the contents of the hidden room constituted property intentionally concealed by a deceased owner who had taken affirmative, documented steps to prevent it from passing to her son or his descendants, that Gerald Pruitt's ownership of the structure itself did not extend to items he had neither known of nor made any effort to discover across years of ownership, and that Mara Doyle, as the person who had discovered the concealment and whom Augusta Pruitt's letter identified, in substance if not in strict legal form, as an intended beneficiary, held the superior claim to its contents. The ruling didn't award her everything cleanly. The court ordered a portion set at a flat sum well below the full appraised value, held in trust pending a public notice period, during which any other party with a legitimate claim to specific items, family members of other customers whose unclaimed pieces might surface in the ledger the way the Osei ring had, could come forward, a provision Renee had actually pushed for herself, arguing it protected Mara from future disputes far more than it cost her anything real. The house itself remained legally Gerald's, though the court noted, almost in passing, that his financial position relative to the property was, as the record showed, considerably compromised regardless of this ruling's outcome. Mara sat very still through all of it, Eli's hand tight in hers, and did not fully understand, until Renee set the papers down and looked at her directly, that it was actually over. "You won," Renee said. "It's not the full number," Ruth quoted, "not until the notice period closes and whatever residual claims get sorted, but by any reasonable estimate, you are looking at somewhere north of $100 million, once the OCE ring and whatever else surfaces gets carved out properly. I want to say that plainly, because I don't think it's fully landed yet, looking at your face." It hadn't. Mara sat in the waiting room chair with her son pressed against her side, and felt something enormous and formless moving through her chest that didn't have a name yet, not victory exactly, not even relief in its purest form, something closer to the specific, disorienting vertigo of a person who has spent 11 months learning to expect nothing and is now being asked to recalibrate everything at once. "Mum," Eli's voice, quiet, careful. "Does this mean we're not leaving Colworth?" "I don't know yet, baby." She found she could smile at that question now, in a way she hadn't been able to in the car outside his school weeks before. "But I know we get to decide that ourselves now, instead of somebody else deciding it for us. That part I'm sure of." Gerald did not appeal the ruling. Deb heard, through the same reliable channel that had carried every other piece of this story through Colworth over the preceding month, that his lawyer had advised against it, that the finding on the treasure trove doctrine alone was strong enough that further litigation risked burning money he no longer reliably had. The Emmerich deal, already dead in the water from the injunction, never resurrected itself. Within 2 months, word came that Gerald had put the house up for sale outright, at a price considerably lower than what Emmerich had once offered, simply to relieve pressure on his remaining mortgages before the bank made the decision for him. Mara bought it. She didn't decide to right away, sat with the idea for weeks first, turned it over the way she turned over most large decisions now, slowly, with Renee's careful counsel and a financial advisor Renee had helped her find, a soft-spoken woman named Adaeze Chukwu, who spent their first 3 meetings simply teaching Mara the vocabulary of having money before ever discussing what to do with it. But in the end, the house pulled at her in a way she couldn't fully explain to anyone else. The window over the sink, the plum tree in the yard, the pantry where a 9-year-old's toy car had changed the whole shape of both their lives. She paid Gerald his asking price without negotiating, which Adaeze gently suggested wasn't the shrewdest financial move available to her, and Mara had agreed, and done it anyway, because some things weren't actually about being shrewd. She hired contractors to open the back room properly, not to strip it of whatever history remained, but to preserve it, at Ruth Callahan's urging, as something closer to a small private memorial than a renovated closet. The workbench stayed. Augusta's cardigan, carefully cleaned and stabilized by a textile conservator Ruth knew, went into a glass case built into the wall beside it, along with a printed copy of the letter and a short plaque that Mara had spent longer choosing words for than almost anything else in the whole process, because it felt important to get right. It read simply, "Augusta Pruitt built this in secret so that someone with nowhere else to turn would someday have somewhere to turn. 1934 to 1971. The pocket watch Walter had stolen, the one mentioned in the ledger entry that had done so much work in that courtroom, turned up eventually too, sold decades ago to a pawnbroker 2 towns over, whose records, improbably, Ruth managed to trace through a string of estate sales spanning 50 years. Mara bought it back and had it restored and gave it, quietly, without any public announcement, to the local historical society, where it sat now beside 3 old photographs of a shuttered storefront on Main Street, a small object carrying a story most visitors would never fully know unless someone like Ruth stood beside them and told it. She did not become a different person overnight, the way Mara had half feared she might, watching from a distance the occasional cautionary story about lottery winners and their ruined lives. She kept working the diner 2 shifts a week for the better part of a year after the ruling, not because she needed the money, but because Frank Mercer had put her back on the schedule when nobody had asked him to, and Deb still worked the counter beside her, and there was something in the ordinary rhythm of pouring coffee and running a register that she wasn't ready to give up just because she no longer had to do it. Mr. Abernathy still came in most Fridays and asked after Eli by name, and Mara found, more than once, that she still valued that small kindness exactly as much as she had back when it was one of the only soft things happening to her before noon. She did leave the cleaning route behind, and the propane bill worry, and the particular quiet dread of running numbers in her head every night that had lived with her for 11 straight months. She paid off what remained of Danny's truck loan, a debt she'd been quietly servicing out of what little was left after the funeral costs, and finally opened the laptop with the password taped inside the cover, and sat with his spreadsheet for a long time one evening after Eli was asleep, not because she needed the numbers anymore, but because it felt, in some way she couldn't quite explain even to herself, like the last conversation she'd never gotten to finish with him. She set up a fund within the year, modest by the standards of what she now had access to, but not modest by any standard Colworth itself was used to, aimed specifically at families facing the kind of midnight deadline she'd stood under herself. Emergency rental bridges, the kind of $1,000 gap that had gotten her turned away at Patrice's laminate desk at the Colworth Community Bank. She structured it so Patrice herself could administer it. In fact, once Mara understood that the loan officer's hands had been as tied by the bank's own risk formulas as anyone else's, and Patrice cried a little, the first time Mara sat across that same desk and explained what she wanted to build, though this time nobody in the room needed a photograph of golden retrievers to make the moment feel less like a place where people got told no. Renata called the week the ruling came down, having heard the news second-hand before Mara had even found the words to call her directly, and there was a long silence on the line before her sister said, quietly, that she was glad, truly glad, and that she hoped Mara knew the offer of the fold-out couch had never once been about anything except love, whatever Craig's careful questions might have sounded like from the outside. Mara told her she knew that. She meant it more than she expected to, once she'd had a little distance from that particular stone in her stomach. Eli adjusted the way children often do, faster in some ways than the adults around him, and slower in others nobody could have predicted. He kept the matchbox car that had started it all in a small wooden box on his dresser, refused, gently but firmly, to let anyone replace it with something nicer, and told the story of that night to his fourth-grade class the following spring, as part of a show-and-tell assignment, with the particular deadpan seriousness of a boy who had decided, somewhere along the way, that the strangest thing that would ever happen to him had already happened, and everything after it was simply life continuing on. He asked, once, on a quiet evening about 6 months after the ruling, whether Mara thought his father would have liked Augusta Pruitt, and Mara had to sit with the question a moment before she answered, because it wasn't one she'd expected, and it mattered more than most questions did lately. "I think your dad would have liked anybody who built something with their own two hands and never gave up on it, even when nobody else believed it mattered," she said. "So yes, I think he would have liked her a great deal." Pearl still lived next door, though Mara had offered, more than once, to help her with anything she wanted, a new roof, a trip somewhere she'd always talked about, and Pearl had turned down every offer except one, a new furnace, because she said she was tired of never getting warm in her own back rooms either, and she'd take that much and not a penny more, because there was, as she liked to remind Mara, no prize for accepting charity you didn't actually need, same as there was none for suffering alone. She still came over most evenings, still brought a casserole dish more often than the occasion strictly called for, still sat at Mara's kitchen table, the same kitchen table now standing in the same kitchen that had once nearly emptied out entirely into the back of a 19-year-old Corolla, and told stories about the town the way only someone who had lived 70-some years inside it really could. Ruth Callahan finished her full history of Augusta Pruitt within the year, a slim, careful monograph the Historical Society published with Mara's quiet financial backing, and on the evening of its small launch event, held in the very room that had once been Pruitt's Jewelry and Repair before it became, decades later, an insurance office, and was now, thanks to a fund of Mara's, being restored back towards something closer to its original purpose as a community archive space. Mara stood near the back of the room and listened to Ruth read the closing lines aloud to a modest but attentive crowd, and thought, not for the first time, about a woman who had spent 20 years building something in secret, out of nothing but the stubborn conviction that someday, somebody who needed it enough would be standing exactly where they needed to be standing, looking exactly hard enough to find it. Gerald Pruitt moved out of Colworth entirely within 18 months, taking a job managing rental properties for a company 2 states over. And Mara heard, second-hand and much later, that he'd sent a short note to Renee's office not long after the sale finalized, addressed, oddly, to no one in particular, simply stating that he hoped the house had finally found somebody who'd take care of it the way his grandmother would have wanted. Mara kept the note in the same drawer where she kept Augusta's letter, not because she'd forgiven everything about that night on the porch, but because she'd learned, over the year that followed it, that most people carried more than one true thing inside them at once: fear and greed and, somewhere underneath it if you looked hard enough, occasionally something almost like conscience, arriving late but arriving all the same. On the 2nd anniversary of the night the panel had first swung open, Mara stood in the pantry doorway with Eli beside her, 11 years old now, and taller than the boy who had once knelt on that cold floor chasing a toy car into a gap behind the shelving, and looked at the small glass case built into the wall, Augusta's cardigan folded inside it, the letter beneath it in Augusta's own careful hand, still legible after all these years, still saying exactly what it had always said. "Take care of this house. Take care of whoever you love inside it. You did," Mara said quietly, to a woman 50-some years gone, standing in a kitchen that had finally, fully become her own. Outside the window over the sink, the old plum tree was heavy with fruit again, for the first time in years. The branches Mara had finally paid someone to prune properly, and somewhere beyond it, the whole ordinary evening of Colworth went on unhurried around her, street lights coming on one by one, a town that had spent a decade learning how to hold its breath now finally, in its own small and particular way, beginning to exhale. The Osei family came to the house for the first time on a Sunday afternoon in early spring. 3 of them, Curtis Osei and his 2 grown daughters, driving up from 2 counties over in a sedan that looked freshly washed for the occasion. Mara had offered to bring the ring to them instead, had said so more than once over the phone, but Curtis had insisted, gently, that he wanted to see the place, wanted to stand in the room where his grandmother's ring had sat untouched in the dark for 70-some years, while 3 generations of his own family grew up not knowing what had become of it. She met them at the door with Eli beside her, 11 years old that spring and tall enough now that he'd stopped needing to be introduced as her son before people worked it out on their own, and led them back through the kitchen to the little glass case built into the pantry wall. Curtis stood in front of it for a long time without saying anything, his daughters flanking him, and when he finally spoke his voice had gone rough in a way that made Mara look away out of something close to instinct, the particular privacy a person's grief deserves even when it's grief for something good finally coming home. "My grandmother used to tell my mother that Ring just walked off," he said. "That was the joke in our family. Rings don't walk. She never once said it easy, though. There was always something underneath it when she told that story, something that never quite got explained." He turned to Mara. "You didn't have to give this back. Your lawyer told me that Plain, when she first called, said the court had already set it aside as a separate matter, said I could have fought for it if I'd wanted to make a thing of it, but that you were planning to hand it over regardless, first thing, before anybody made you." "It was never mine to keep," Mara said. "Augusta wrote that herself in a way. She kept a ledger of everything that ever passed through that shop, because she believed things belonged to the people they belonged to, even when the world made that inconvenient. I wasn't going to be the one who broke that pattern the first chance I got." Curtis's older daughter, a school teacher named Adaora, asked if she could hold the ring once Mara opened the case, and Mara watched her turn it over in her palm, the same way Mara herself had turned it over that first night, tilting it toward the light to catch the 2 scratched initials, and something passed across her face that looked, for just a moment, exactly like the flicker Mara had felt kneeling on that cold pantry floor with her son's hand tight in hers, the specific vertigo of touching a piece of a story that had waited decades to finally reach the person it belonged to. They stayed for dinner that night, at Mara's insistence, and Pearl came over uninvited the way she always did, whenever she caught wind of company, bringing a pie nobody had asked for, and staying twice as long as she'd planned to. And by the time the Oseis finally drove home well after dark, headlights sweeping down the driveway the same way headlights once had on the worst night of Mara's life, the house felt, for a few hours at least, like it had been built for exactly this kind of gathering, instead of the fear it had once been asked to hold. The housing fund took longer to find its footing than Mara had expected, not because the need wasn't there, Patrice could have told her that from the first week, but because Mara found herself wanting to build it carefully rather than quickly, wary of the particular kind of help that arrives loud and leaves people feeling smaller for having needed it. She spent months sitting in on meetings with Patrice and Adeize Chukwu, working out eligibility that didn't require humiliation, a paperwork process that didn't take 3 weeks to process an emergency that couldn't wait 3 days, a name for the whole thing that she'd wrestled with longer than almost any other decision in the entire process, before finally settling on something simple. The Birch Hollow Fund, after the road, after the house, after the particular kind of midnight that had started all of it, the first family it helped, that autumn, was a woman named Priya Anand, a home health aide raising 2 kids alone after a divorce that had left her holding debts that weren't hers to begin with, facing a landlord who'd given her 30 days to come up with back rent she genuinely didn't have. Patrice called Mara herself, the way they'd agreed she would for the first several cases, not to ask permission exactly, but because Patrice had said, the day the fund launched, that she wanted Mara to know, at least a few times, exactly what her own worst month had turned into for somebody else. She cried in my office, Patrice told her, the same way you did, if you don't mind me saying so. Except this time I got to tell her yes. Mara didn't meet Priya Anand in person, not at first, kept the fund's structure deliberately at arm's length from her own daily life, so it wouldn't turn into something that asked its recipients to perform gratitude in front of the person who'd made it possible. But she thought about her often that autumn, driving past the Ferncrest diner on her way to pick Eli up from school, thought about a woman somewhere in Colworth getting to sleep one more night in a bed that was still hers, and found that the thought did something for her that even the largest number in Ruth's original appraisal never quite had. Renee Castillo's practice grew that year too, not because of Mara's case alone, but because of what came after it. Word travelling the particular way word travels in a county the size of Ashcombe, that there was a lawyer in Colworth who took cases other firms wouldn't touch, and didn't ask for money up front from clients who didn't have any. Mara helped her rent a proper office eventually, a real one with more than 4 chairs in the waiting room and a heater that didn't have to work quite so hard against the October chill, though Renee had insisted, characteristically, on paying real rent for it herself, once the practice could sustain that, unwilling, even now, to let the line between client and benefactor blur any further than it already had. Foster Lang, of all people, sent Renee a case referral the following spring, a modest landlord-tenant dispute he said didn't suit his own firm's usual work, but that he thought she'd handle well, and Renee had laughed reading the note aloud to Mara over the phone, not unkindly, more with the particular disbelief of 2 people who'd spent a courtroom fighting each other and come out the other side with something almost like professional respect. Neither one had expected to still be standing there afterward. Deb Ruiz left the diner 2 years after the ruling, not because anything had gone wrong, but because Mara had quietly funded a small bakery Deb had talked about opening since before either of them could remember, tucked into one of the empty storefronts along Main Street that had sat dark since the Redfern plant closed a decade before. Frank Mercer grumbled about losing his best server for exactly one conversation before he showed up at the bakery's opening morning with a bouquet of grocery store flowers and told Deb, gruffly, that the diner's coffee had gotten worse the day she left the floor, which, from Frank, was about as close to sentiment as anyone had ever heard him get. The storefronts on Main Street filled in slowly after that, not all because of Mara. Colworth had needed considerably more than one family's fortune to turn a decade of decline around, but she funded enough of the early ones, the bakery, a hardware store that replaced the one 2 towns over where she'd once met Danny stocking shelves, a small clinic that meant families no longer had to drive 40 minutes for a pediatrician, that the town started, slowly and without any single dramatic turning point, to feel less like a place holding its breath and more like a place that had finally exhaled and decided to keep going. Eli grew up inside all of it, the way children do, treating extraordinary circumstances as simply the shape his particular childhood happened to take. He kept working summers at the bakery counter for Deb starting the year he turned 13, insisted on it over Mara's gentle suggestion that he didn't need to, told her flatly that Danny had worked jobs he didn't need either, because a person ought to know how to earn something with their own hands, regardless of what else was sitting in a bank account somewhere. Mara had not argued with that. She recognized, hearing it, something of his father in the stubborn set of his jaw, the same look he'd had kneeling on the pantry floor at 9 years old, insisting there was a hole in the wall, when every practical instinct told her there couldn't possibly be. Pearl passed the winter Eli turned 14, quietly, in her sleep, in the same house she'd lived in for going on 50 years by then, and Mara found herself, in the weeks that followed, doing something she hadn't expected to do, going through old boxes in the pantry's little glass case room, and finding, tucked behind Augusta's letter, a card Pearl had given her that very first Christmas after the ruling, before either of them had known the full shape of what the fund would become, that read simply, in Pearl's looping schoolteacher hand, that there was no prize for suffering alone, but there was, she'd written, a particular kind of grace in a person who'd suffered and come out the other side, still willing to hand somebody else a rag to dry their hands with. Mara kept that card in the same drawer as the letter and Gerald's note, 3 small pieces of paper that had, each in their own way, taught her something about the distance between what people were entitled to and what they chose, in the moment that mattered, to actually do. Ruth Callahan's monograph on Augusta Pruitt found its way, eventually, into a regional historical journal, and then, a few years later, into a chapter of a book about overlooked women of early 20th century small business, and Ruth herself, well into her 70s by then, still stopped by the house once or twice a year to check on the glass case, still talked about Augusta the way some people talk about a friend they'd simply never had the chance to meet in life. On the 5th anniversary of the night the panel had first swung open, Mara stood once more in the pantry doorway, Eli nearly grown now and home from his first year away at school, and looked at the case in the wall, the letter behind its glass, the cardigan folded exactly as it had been folded the day the conservator finished her work. Outside, the plum tree was heavy again, the way it seemed to be most years now that someone finally tended it properly, and somewhere down the road the lights of the bakery and the clinic and the hardware store glowed faintly against the early dark, small proof of a decade's worth of choices that had started, improbably, with a 9-year-old chasing a toy car into a gap behind a kitchen shelf. "We're still here," Mara said, to a woman 50-some years gone, and found that she no longer needed to explain to herself why she still talked to her sometimes, still felt, standing in that particular room, like she owed her an accounting of what had been built out of what she'd left behind. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.